Okay, right. Hello, everybody. I can see all of our participants starting to come into this webinar. We will give it a few minutes. We've got over 250 people from across Australia participating today. So we'll just wait for everybody to get online and then we'll do some introductions. Okay, we might get started because we've only got an hour and obviously we've got a lot of things to cover in that hour. Welcome to everyone to this very interesting and topical webinar subject for today. My name is Belinda Honey. I'm one of the executive directors for Mapian based in Perth. So I'll be hosting this webinar today, and joining with me will be Alex Aspromogis, who is based in our Brisbane office and is a fellow executive director, and Blake Redding, who is based as well in our Brisbane office and he's one of our associate directors. Alex today will be very much talking to us about, sorry, I've just had someone raise their hand. I'll just have a look at that in a minute. Alex is going to talk to us today about some of the legal issues and some of the legal challenges and how to manage some of the issues around mandatory vaccination in the workplace. And Blake will be coming from the perspective of an organisational psychologist in terms of working with your employees around this really sensitive topic and trying to make the conversations happen and have those honest and open conversations with your employees. So thank you to everybody today. We do have a lot of participants today from across Australia, and I'm sure that as we go through the webinar, you're going to have a lot of questions. The way that we're actually going to set up the webinar, we're going to start with a bit of a presentation where Alex is going to look at some of those legal and challenging aspects and also talk about what's happening across Australia at the moment and have a look at some of the case law that's occurring at the moment in the Fair Work Commission and other jurisdictions. And then Blake's going to talk about some of the things that have been happening over the last 18 months in respect to employees at work, and then give some advice on how to effectively manage some of those areas. So once we've finished that presentation, we're then going to move into questions. And the questions, I've obviously got a few questions to ask our panelists, but I'm sure all of you have some questions as well. So what we will do is we will keep an eye on our Q&A and chat area. So if any of you have a question that you want to ask, please make sure that you lodge that through the Q&A. We will keep an eye on it. We will answer as many questions as we can today, but with so many participants, it might be a bit difficult. But we will answer what we can. And if we can't answer them, then we will try and get back to you after the webinar with some responses. We'll also be providing a copy of the presentation as well to all of the participants today. So thank you. Before I pass on to the panelists, I just want to sort of open the day. Obviously, the last 18 months with COVID has been like a steam train going around the world, and Australia has definitely not escaped its path. From a personal, workforce and community perspective, all of us have been impacted in some way. And now what we're seeing is with the introduction of vaccinations, we're seeing a new step in the COVID journey. Through amazing and timely medical science, we've now got these vaccines that help us fight this pandemic. And it was on Tuesday, it was just announced that we'd hit the double vaccination target of 70% over 16 in Australia, having double vaccination, and 85% have received their first jabs. But we all know we've still got a long way to go. And in many rural areas, and Alex will talk about this a little bit as well, many rural areas and isolated communities, states like WA and Queensland, we're not as high as other states. We've also got a small percentage of the workforce who are against COVID vaccinations. States are all managing the opening of the country in different ways, with some states having public health orders relating to this area extending far beyond what other states have. And we've even got unions. Even this morning, there's a report that the CFMEU in New South Wales is taking on BHP coal in relation to the introduction of mandatory vaccinations at the Mount Arthur coal mine in New South Wales. And they're taking it on the basis that they're saying it's not a lawful and reasonable direction. So there's a lot happening in this area. It's happening quickly. It's changing every day. But, you know, we hope that through this webinar today, we can give you a little bit of guidance and help you on the journey that you and your employees will take down this path, because all of this is creating the perfect storm for employers and creating a number of challenges that we've just never faced before, not in the last 50 odd years. So Alex and Blake are going to help us to navigate a path through some of these challenging issues from a workplace perspective. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the presentations. Like I said, encourage all of you to ask questions and we will keep an eye on them. So we're going to commence the presentations with Alex. And while Alex is setting up to share his screen with the presentation, we actually also have a quick poll that we would all like all of you, the participants, to answer as well, just to give us a bit of a feel for what's happening within this group at the moment. So as you can see, it's popped up on your screen. Has your company introduced, or does your company intend to introduce a mandatory COVID vaccinations in the workplace? So I'll just give everybody a little bit of time to answer that, and then I will end the poll and you'll be able to see where we are. It's quite interesting. It's a bit of a split, pretty equally split at the moment. So, okay, we're just getting to the last group. All right. Okay, we'll end it there. And I'll share the results quickly on the screen. I think you can see that at the moment. Alex, can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, great. Okay. So as you can see, really interesting, a really pretty even split. 33% have said yes, we have introduced or intend to introduce mandatory vaccinations. 26% have said no, we have not or do not intend to introduce, and 41% are unsure. So interesting. And I think from what our interactions with employers across Australia, that is pretty consistent to the conversations that we're having. So on that note, I will shut that down and I'll pass over to Alex, who will start taking us through the presentation. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, thank you, Belinda. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I thought I'd start this off just by giving a bit of an overview of what the kind of state of play is at the moment across the country. Obviously, we're all experiencing different things depending on our geographic locations. So some kind of headline numbers: 145,000 cases, 1,500 deaths. I think you can see from the graph up here with the daily number of reported cases, the situation the country has found itself in, specifically New South Wales and Victoria over the last 3 or 4 months. Cases by age group, in the 20 to 39 is the highest percentages, but with deaths in the older range from 70 to the 90 age group. The vaccine rollout is commenced in earnest, and every day we're reminded of the need to get single vax, double vaxxed. So these numbers are a couple of days ago. So I think Belinda gave slightly higher figures a minute ago, but basically around 70% single vaxxed, 85% double vaxxed across the country, but variation from state to state. And as has been indicated, Queensland, WA are lagging behind. The ACT, New South Wales and Victoria are hitting significant numbers at the moment, and that's probably related to the fact that Queensland, WA have had it relatively good without a lot of restrictions, and there hasn't been a pressing kind of need for vaccination. But with the proposed opening of borders, that is likely to increase, we're expecting, over the next few months. So what has the government been doing around the country to try and respond to the threat of COVID-19? And the single most important tool throughout this whole process has been the use of public health orders. So it's set up under various kind of public health legislation, both federally and under all the state and territory governments. And a number of initiatives have been put in place to try and spread, to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So I've identified there all those things that we've experienced over the last 18 months. So we've got border closures, bans on mass gatherings, travel restrictions, face masks, social distancing, reducing capacities of various kind of hospitality-related venues, school closures, homeschooling, lockdowns, quarantine for overseas returning Australians, or for those that have been close contacts to a COVID-19 case. Significant restrictions around aged care visitation, and of those 1,500 deaths in Australia, about half have occurred in aged care facilities. So that's been quite a focus of all governments from the outset because of the vulnerability of that group. And then bans on particular types of businesses operating or operating under their normal procedures really throughout the whole kind of process. And we continue to see that today across the country. In more recent times, we've started to see public health orders and directions specifically around a mandatory vaccination. And these have very much been determined on a state-by-state basis based on the particular kind of assessment of risk at a point in time, and focused largely around the extent of community transmission. So what we have seen fairly universally is the requirements for workers in residential aged care, hospital and healthcare, quarantine, schools, childcare, early education workers to be double vaccinated over a period of time. Currently in Victoria, there's a very broad requirement for a double vaccination on authorised workers, and it is a very, very broad range of occupations, and virtually every position falls within that. Similarly, we've seen construction workers in Victoria, hospitality, entertainment and non-critical retail workers in New South Wales until the 1st of December. And again, in New South Wales, some limitations around the 12 kind of local government authorities of concern around construction workers and other authorised workers. In WA, there's now a requirement being placed on FIFO mining employees and resource workers, and a recent announcement that a more general requirement will soon be implemented. We've also seen transport, logistics and freight workers that move across boundaries having to be double vaccinated. And looking at the list of participants today, a number of you are already caught by some of those public health orders, and there's some positive onus on you to ensure that they are enforced. And the absence of that is a breach which can result in penalties both to the individuals involved and also the organisations. The kind of main issue from a workplace perspective that's come out of COVID-19 is the occupational health and safety obligations that employers have. And essentially, all employers have a duty to eliminate, or if it's not possible to eliminate, to reduce, so far as reasonably practical, the risk of exposure to COVID-19 at the workplace. So it is an identified risk. It's a risk that we're all aware of, therefore a risk that we have to take some sort of measures to manage. And those steps really depend on a number of factors, including the likelihood of an employee being exposed to COVID-19 at the workplace, So that may result from a customer-facing role is more likely to have contact with a variety of individuals. The degree of harm that would result if COVID-19 was present in the workplace, and again, using the kind of textbook example there of, your aged care facility, if COVID-19 entered that workplace, the likelihood would be death of some of those individuals. The third is the availability and suitability of control measures to eliminate the risk. And I guess one thing to stress as part of this process is while we're focusing on mandatory vaccination, there are a number of other control measures that can be implemented as an alternative to or in conjunction with that. So there may be a capacity for an employer to appropriately address their occupational health and safety requirements without the need to introduce mandatory vaccination. And the final one is the cost of implementing the control measures. Lots of organisations are looking at it from a more holistic way. So while OH&S is one element of that and exposing their employees and customers to risk is a significant issue, there's also other factors that are being taken into account by businesses in that consideration about do we or don't we move to a mandatory vaccination framework. So the existence of public health orders, again, are mandatory and binding upon employers. Obligations imposed by third parties, so customers or clients. We have clients who are currently saying we will not allow people to attend our sites that do not have double vaccination. The level of community transmission, obviously it's quite variable across Australia at the moment, but with borders opening, who knows what's going to happen. The availability of vaccines. So in some remote areas, vaccine availability is still a challenge and still an issue, with vaccine only being available a couple of days a week or a couple of days a month. Organisations are focusing on their commitment to safety for their employees and more broadly, I guess, their kind of social responsibility as good corporate citizens. There's some organisations that have identified, because they do deal with large groups of employees in confined space, that they are a potential to be a super spreader. And many organisations are focusing on what if we get COVID at our workplace, what is going to be the specific risk to the continuity of the business? If I operate a manufacturing facility and COVID is detected there, what does that mean? Do all my employees have to go into quarantine for 14 days? Do I have to close the facility? Do I have to do deep clean, et cetera, et cetera? A lot of discussion around lawful and reasonable instruction. So, and this is a long-held kind of common law process where employees are required to comply with a lawful and reasonable instruction given to them by their employer. Now, what is particularly reasonable is determined on a case-by-case basis. So the number of factors that need to be considered in this, the nature of the workplace, the risk of transmission, potential impact of transmission, existence of the public health orders and their application, OH&S obligations, nature of the employee, and the reason for the employee's non-compliance. So in any given case, all of those things are issues that need to be considered. And what might be a lawful and reasonable instruction to someone is not necessarily a lawful and reasonable instruction to someone else who may have a legitimate medical reason to not be vaccinated, as the kind of, again, textbook example it's given. Lots of case law. Every day there are cases and interim kind of proceedings occurring across Australia in a variety of different jurisdictions. So I've tried to kind of capture what some of the key decisions are, both in relation to COVID-19, but more generally about flu vaccinations. So Kuru in Cheltenham involved a situation where an employee was given a direction not to interact with employees in other zones. So they split the workplace into zones without full PPE. They did so, albeit before work outside of the work premises, but that was found to be a lawful reason to dismiss on the basis of failure to follow a lawful and reasonable instruction. Both the Good Start and the Auscare decisions related to individuals who refused to get a flu vaccination. The first dealing where their role related to working in close proximity to children, and the second one where they were home care and dealing with vulnerable kind of clients. The Davison Minister for Health and Kazam and Hazard are two cases where individuals supported by, no doubt, anti-vax lobby groups have taken governments to court to try and get declarations that the public health orders were invalid, and both of those had been overturned. The Sarah case is a case involving an application for workers' compensation where an employee who had travelled to the United States, got COVID, died, was accepted as a statutory workers' compensation case, and the widow received a lump sum payment. The Kimber decision is interesting because it's directly on point in relation to COVID. So Ms. Kimber claimed a medical contraindication because she had developed some kind of rash as a result of a flu vaccination, and she produced evidence from a Chinese herbal physician and also a GP statement relying on patient observation rather than diagnosis. Fair Work Commission found at first instance that that there was a valid reason to terminate based on the inherent requirements of the role. Majority of the full bench upheld that decision on appeal, but Deputy President Dean kind of wrote quite a scathing judgment, which basically said that she didn't agree with mandatory vaccination and that under no circumstances could it be a legitimate kind of exercise of an employer's workplace right. So that minority decision is not binding, but it's providing a basis for those wanting to reject mandatory vaccination to point to some judicial authority. In the Kassam and Hazard decision, the judge in the Supreme Court on that occasion heavily criticised the decision of Deputy President Dean and really cut it to bits in relation to what she was or was not supposed to have determined in relation to that case. So various organisations who have publicly announced that they are proceeding with mandatory vaccination. I think it's important that we all understand too that the reasons for vaccine hesitancy is distinct from vaccine refusal. So it's not the right approach to lump all employees who are not prepared at this point in time to be vaccinated as being anti-vaxxers. So many of them have quite legitimate kind of concerns about safety. They also have concerns that this is being imposed upon them and that their personal choice is being denied. And we've seen FIFO workers in kind of Carafa railing against that. There's issues about vaccine availability. There are some people that have researched this quite heavily and want a particular vaccine that may not be readily available or available in the Australian market. There's that lack of motivation. There's not a crisis in WA or Queensland at the moment. And there's the distrust of government and big businesses that there's some kind of conspiracy theory out there. The other thing we also have to be conscious of is discriminatory attributes. So the obvious one again is medical impairment or disability, but there's also been suggestions that there may be discrimination on the basis of religion, pregnancy or political opinion, and they're still a work in progress and there hasn't been a lot of decisions or case law on that at this point, but it's a risk that needs to be identified. So non-compliance. If you're implementing a process of mandatory vaccination to attend work, the result of non-compliance is not necessarily termination of employment. It is an option, but it is not the only option. So as you go through that process and you're faced with the situation of how do we enforce the standard, if people are refusing vaccination, then you need to consider some other options. That includes use of PPE, other control measures, rapid antigen testing. Another is work from home, if that's possible, giving people a variety of forms of either paid or unpaid leave. So there are all kind of options that need to be considered as you go through, but it is important that in considering how to implement that you're not creating unacceptable precedents that you may have difficulties in following in the future. And that's it for me, and I'll hand over to Blake.
Thanks, Alex. Blake. can you enlighten us in respect to working with employees in this area?
Yeah, as much as I can. And that's where I thought the industrial relations landscape really sets the boundaries at the moment in terms of what employers can be doing and perhaps what they cannot be doing. Probably the topical area that we're becoming involved with around the organisational psychology piece is about where there's an element of choice behind people's vaccination behaviour, and that's unlocking a little bit about how do we go about bringing up the topic for conversation, and also the role of surveys in understanding people's intent to be vaccinated. So I wanted to provide a bit of a state of play that's helpful to have in mind if we are battling or thinking about the impact of hesitancy on us in our businesses. And benchmarking in terms of understanding about what to expect and what's high or what's low, I thought could be helped by if we have a glance back in time where research into, I guess, vaccination hesitancy before the COVID vaccinations were released, sat at about, back in May 2020, about that sort of 19 to 24% mark globally, which sort of sets a bit of a benchmark as to what to expect in the normal general population. And you'd expect the working population to be slightly, I guess, less hesitancy because of the reduced vulnerability or vulnerable people being in the workforce. And I guess what's interesting where you see other, I guess, employee or people's perceptions coming out where early this year, the trust factor in a vaccine was at about that sort of 66% mark, which isn't high, and you can see the attitudes towards it aligning with people thinking that their families want to be vaccinated, aligns quite well with the current vaccination rates that we're seeing in Australia at the moment. More recently, and in the context of employment, Elmo released their figures of a sentiment survey that showed 88% of workers really comfortable with this concept of tracking vaccination status, and the 58% of employees uncomfortable working with other employees who aren't vaccinated, and that was actually on the increase as well. So they're going to be moving perceptions as the vaccination rates move, and we'll tend to see this, I guess, fundamental human bias towards what I do and think is the right way, which will start to flow into what people are thinking. Some of the more recent, well, the most recent that I could uncover out of the Melbourne Institute was sort of collected in September. And this really gives that sort of 18% hesitancy of people in the workforce, which is probably about the figure to expect and what you'll tend to see coming out in any internal surveys that you might be doing. And this is where our advice is, if it's within grasp and capabilities of your organisation, that to be including some form of survey to understand people's status and perceptions towards vaccinations is a helpful step to take, because it does form part of a consultation process. When done with empathy, and the right intent, it does actually create the safety for helpful conversations to be underway, as opposed to avoiding something that's really important to talk about in the workplace and is at front of mind for a lot of different people. I think the 18% though, where I think one of the appetite for a universal trend or way of doing things through COVID just has never existed, which is making us all so much more tired in every aspect of personal and our work life. And unpacking that 18% figure across different industries. So this is a representative sample of employees across Australia from the Melbourne Institute, and it really shows the high variation in terms of hesitancy to become vaccinated, which really is going to become more challenging as mandatory vaccination policies become more prevalent across different industries. And so this is where you can see straight up that the construction industry is really facing that highest level of hesitancy, and where we sort of would use I like to look at the World Health Organization, where they classify hesitancy into, I guess, 3 key areas as to why people might choose not to become vaccinated. And that's where there is a sense of complacency that we are seeing in Queensland and Western Australia, and it's not important to us right now. There's the level of convenience, which is the accessibility and how easy it is to become vaccinated. And the item that really does tend to hold people back over a longer period of time is the confidence, and that's what taps more into people's personal beliefs and information gathering. So I think in terms of getting a handle on where your business hesitancy is and the importance of it will probably be quite similar to what we see based on your industry on this snapshot. This is very recent. And when we are gathering information, I guess it's an opportunity not to just look at vaccination intent and status, but it's also that opportunity to check people's satisfaction with the COVID safety measures that are in place. And then also the flexible work opportunities that might be, if they're viable, coming in with the vaccination approach as well. The other...
Sorry, Blade, can I just interrupt you there? One of the participants has just asked if we'll share these slides after, or should they take a screenshot of what you've just put up? We will definitely be sharing slides afterwards. So
we'll share the slides, and in the references, we'll share the link to this research, because this is actually really good research that's released each month as well. And this is where this can help frame how we might be approaching some of these conversations and sharing information, and just gives that sort of global insight into what's happening, in our different professions.
Thanks.
And I think that's where we do sort of lean into the conversations around hesitancy to become vaccinated. That will come to the forefront as policies require them more so. And this is where I guess our sort of advice and thinking is to acknowledge that an employer has never really taken it upon themselves to tell people not to smoke or to stop smoking, and from a behavioural perspective. And it's not really an expectation the employees are telling people to get vaccinated until that policy starts to hit home and it doesn't leave any other choice. But where we do experience that resistance, it's the managers, or our frontline supervisors that are really stuck in that firing line. And this level of resistance that we can encounter, can be stronger in different contexts, but resistance that managers, supervisors will encounter through resistance through decisions they might disagree with around salary, promotion, performance expectations. So it's a skill set that we do have and can unpack and apply into, I guess, the vaccination conversation. But given that it will be new for many people, that's where the discomfort will come up for managers. So we're needing to support supervisors in how to have those types of conversations. And that's where scenarios and examples we find to be quite helpful. And the aspect too is that where we don't tell people to stop smoking, but we might require them to follow particular standards to reduce the effect on other people. It's quite an emotional, behaviorally driven state of play. And so there's many biases at play. And I guess we kind of encourage a more coaching oriented approach to having these conversations, because telling people what to do when they're emotional and against what you want them to do will often have what we call a backfire effect, in that it pushes people to take their position more strongly. We also find that people who have access to less reliable information or less trust in the science behind, I guess, the advice that they're receiving, will give more credence or credibility to the strength of the narrative or the story behind a position that they might be on. So I guess the appreciation of that can help, I guess, drive that importance, where meeting that, what the coaching philosophy brings is we meet people where they're at from an empathy perspective, from a genuine seek to understand where people's views are coming from. We emphasize the clarity in that whatever the COVID safe processes, policies are, that our supervisors really need to understand where they're coming from, why the standards are what they are, and how they might apply to people, so that they can on share and on communicate that level of clarity, and to acknowledge that emotions will show up in many contexts. This is one of them that will aggravate them more so. And it's also one of these opportunities where there's no right or wrong way to undertake, well, there is a wrong way, but there's probably better ways to undertake these conversations. And this is where I guess it will have a ripple effect on what your culture is into the future. So this is where I'm a strong fan of the use of principles behind particular policies or procedures to help provide a way of doing things that connects with the culture that you're really trying to build in business. Education is absolutely critical, that as an obligation to provide access to credible information for our employees. And I put in there with permission, largely because of the backfire effect. If we do try to push people into a standpoint on the basis of facts alone when they're resisting, it's probably going to do more harm than good. Whereas what we often find is that the hesitancy is often is more vocal or silent in that sense of confidence based on beliefs, is really fueled by a level of fear. And that's where the acknowledgement of emotion helps reduce that level of fear to create an appetite or invitation to exchange information and options and alternatives, which is where learning and shifts in opinion, ideas, will start to happen. And that's why, there's many exceptional coaching tools and models out there. Grow is one of those that I think is so simple and powerful, and you can get as complex as you want to, but it's a tool that we use with managers and is easily accessible and applicable across many contexts.
Great. Thanks, Blake. Okay, we have got questions coming in thick and thin, and I've actually got a few questions for Blake and Alex as well, and many of the questions I've got are actually questions that the participants are asking as well. So maybe after that presentation about the state of the nation, where we are at the moment, let's move into the questions. And Alex, one of the questions we've been asked a few times, and was one of the questions I was going to ask you, was in relation to this privacy area and the privacy. Do we have the right to ask employees to provide details of their vaccination status? And what are the issues around privacy laws in respect to that? Can you give some advice to the participants in that area?
Yeah, certainly in relation to privacy aspects, I guess it comes in kind of two ways in the employment area. So we're looking at privacy in relation to employee records, but also then candidates. For example, if you're going to make double vaccination a requirement for employment. So there's different principles that will apply to each group's kind of technically, in the sense that the privacy principles have employee record exemptions. So the privacy principles themselves don't specifically apply, but obviously this is sensitive, confidential medical information, and you need to ensure that you have appropriate protocols in place to ensure that only the people that need to know do know. So you need to ensure that your internal processes are clear around that. In relation to candidates for roles, if you are seeking that sort of information, then you would have to make sure that you comply with the privacy principles, and possibly at the end of the recruitment process for unsuccessful candidates then to destroy that information.
Right. But you do have a right to ask your employees for that information, do you?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Okay. And one of the other questions that we've been asked a lot within Mappian is around this issue of we're a supplier or consultants or whatever we do, and we have to go into our clients' offices or warehouses or sites or locations, and our clients themselves have said that you can only have people come in if they have been double vaccinated. So if you've got, obviously that places obligations on the employer. If you've got an employee who's refusing to be double vaccinated and therefore can't attend that site, how could you deal with that issue?
It's really the similar example to a public health order. I know it doesn't have that same kind of status in law, but if you need to have a particular qualification, a particular vaccination status to do particular work in a particular location, and you do not have that, then you are not able to undertake the inherent requirements of the role. So it could be treated from that perspective. There's also the situation that, okay, they can't do that work, but is there other work they can do, or can the work be modified in a way that they can still remain in employment? And those other factors will need to be considered through that. So that's particularly relevant, I think, for remote workers that might be a sales-based force. So I've seen this issue coming up with a number of clients over the last couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. And just going back to that the issue around the employee vaccination status, one of the participants has asked the question, can I ask for the employee's vaccination status if we don't have mandatory vaccination in the workplace? Can I still ask for that information?
I think you can. And the reason for collecting that is to understand status so you can determine what OH&S measures you need to put in place. So if everyone is vaccinated in your workplace, then there may be a capacity to be a bit more relaxed in some of the other measures you may implement. But if you know that there are employees at the workplace that are not double vaccinated, then clearly there is a greater risk that needs to be managed, and you need to put in appropriate control measures to minimise their potential exposure.
Yeah. And Brad George has just brought our attention, and we did discuss this yesterday, in terms of the need to comply with the Australian Immunisation Register Act, and that this is very important for medical exemptions. So have you got any advice on that particular issue?
No, I read, Brad, that's absolutely correct. I should have said that as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So Blake, while we give Alex a bit of a rest, and while the questions keep coming in, what would you recommend trying to educate and convince employees first before introducing mandatory vaccinations? Or should we just accept the inevitable that some employers will just never agree and make our decisions that we're not going to, and assume that we're just not going to convince them?
Yeah. Well, I think this one speaks to culture, in a sense that if we take the approach of, we've got a policy coming in, we want people to get vaccinated, so we will educate you so that you take our position, that possibly will encourage the backfire effect. If we're taking more of a longer standing perspective, where I think what's being thrown at us at the moment is more of mandatory vaccinations are coming, how do we respond? I think the feedback at the moment is to say, well, probably in 2022 in Australia, most people in the workplace will experience COVID. So how does our policy play out in terms of when people in our office, or our workplace get COVID, what's going to be the response there? Because most people are going to get it. Even if you are vaccinated, there's the immediate safety of that measure, then the mental health impact of getting a virus that we've been running from nearly 2 years and finally getting it. And then also that aspect around, the conversation around children getting vaccinated hasn't been had yet. So where I'm getting at there is that there's a lot that's happened. There's a lot more that will happen into 2022. And if we're taking a stance of the education we're providing our workforce is to help them feel informed and to make the best possible decisions for them in our workplace and their personal lives, that creates the channel for information to be fed through by credible professionals, but then also trusted workplace representatives too, who can provide their experiences from a storytelling perspective as well, to create a space of psychological safety for people to receive information, but not be told how to think. And it's a bit of a longer answer, but I guess it's that sense of create the channels now for sharing information, because at the moment it's vaccinations, then it's going to be dealing with having COVID, that sense. So there's a lot more to come, so we need to create those channels for people to access information now.
Yeah, that's right. That's good advice. Where look at what's happened in the last 18 months and all the changes that have been happening. There's going to be a lot more happening in the next couple of years in this space, without a doubt. Alex, one of the questions, and I know this company personally, and I know that they're looking at a construction project that's in a very, very remote environment in the middle of Australia. And they are asking a question of, is it reasonable legally to include in contracts, so for example, a construction contract, as the principle, a requirement for all contractors' employees to be vaxxed in order to be able to attend the site? So it's about, can the construction owner or principal actually instruct their contractors to only have vaccinated employees attend the site?
I mean, I think the short answer to that is yes. And it's kind of the reverse side of a number of other questions we've seen come through where the principals are saying to some of the other participants here today, we're only going to let your employees on site that are double vaxxed. And so the answer to both those questions is yes, that can be required and that can be directed. And it's up to the contractor to comply or not take the job.
Yeah, okay. All right, and then we've been asked the question of has Mappin developed a specific COVID policy or does it sit within another policy? We have been working on specific COVID policies for clients, haven't we? So we have been doing
off the shelf.
Yeah. So very specific to the client and their own specific circumstances. So there's not, it's a bit hard to have an off-the-shelf type version, but because each client's got different matters that they're trying to deal with. But yeah, that's definitely something that clients have been introducing a specific COVID policy. Another area that's getting asked is in terms of the liability of an employer if an employee contracts COVID while they're working. Any comments on that particular one, Alex?
If they contract COVID and it can be established that it was contracted at work, then they would be eligible for workers' compensation. I would say in most states, obviously the legislation varies from state to state, but that would be the general kind of position. And that's effectively what that outcome of that SARA case was, where COVID was contracted while travelling for work in the US.
Yeah.
But the thing to be clear is that's a statutory workers' compensation claim. So it's not a common law claim in relation to negligence and the like. So while they might have a statutory common law claim, they would probably unlikely to have a common law claim against the company.
Yeah. And a lot of this is a bit of a moving feast at the moment, isn't it? Because the case law in this area, a lot of it hasn't happened yet, and we're waiting for the outcome of a number of cases.
No, absolutely. It's every day there's developments in this area, and it's very, very difficult to stay on top of it, even whether it's your full-time job. Yeah.
Okay. So what's another? Blake, I've got one for you. One of the panelists, one of the participants has asked, would it be valuable for employers to show transparency that they will explore individual case merits of vaccine refusal to uphold that they are proving reasonableness and finding workable alternatives? So it's just that question of, should they emphasise that they're prepared to look at individual cases?
I think that would definitely form part of the overall policy and supported well by a set of principles that connects the cultural values with how we're executing it, in a sense that where any occasion where a policy expectation is refused, the case-by-case approach is taken. That's where Alex provided there's various options that can be undertaken that will be dependent on the type of work and the workplace. And I think taking the perspective that where people do choose to refuse and they voice it, that there's a two-way adult-to-adult conversation to explore the case would be culturally aligned with where you are now and where you want to get to. So you definitely, the process would need to support that in terms of what reasonable alternative options are available.
Yeah. And one of the questions that a couple of our clients have asked, and we had one in WA recently where the client has introduced a mandatory vaccine policy, but over the last 12 or 18 months during COVID, they did have a number of people working from home, and they've got one employee in particular who, and now they've all returned to the office, but one employee in particular is refusing to have or has indicated they're not going to have a vaccine and is insisting that they work from home. Alex, any comments on how to deal with that tricky one?
Yeah, it is. It's challenging, and I guess it really comes down to what's the reasonable approach in all the circumstances. You really have to take into account the operational kind of requirements and the basis for the objection.
Yeah, It is. It's a really challenging area, this. It's very specific to the individual circumstances in the individual company. So that's one thing that we found. Every scenario from every company that we've been dealing with has been very different, and it's had its own factors that are impacting it. So yeah, it's not an easy one, that's for sure.
I think, Belinda, I'd sort of add to that one where a lot of the advice around work from home, where it was mandatory lockdown, there were many jobs that were required to be work from home, even though it wasn't ideal. And so as we're sort of moving into the new way of work, it may not always be as viable for people to be working from home 100%. So it's not unreasonable to review that as a concept to check whether it is viable, to inform, I guess, what options might be available. And then it also, where that might speak to your working from home policy, the kind of other issue that's probably more the pain point that's brought up is I've got a group of employees pointing at that person in that this is unfair. That behavior of pointing to somebody else about this is unfair comes up in many different contexts and is something that we need to acknowledge, bring up, speak to, with to understand where this emotional trigger is coming from, and what it is that we need to do moving forward and move the focus away from pointing at other people around fairness.
Yeah. And one of the things that's also been raised with us is around this issue of, because this issue of, yes, I've been vaccinated and I'm proud and I've come out and I've said I've been vaccinated, as opposed to the people who are completely anti-vaccine, and then the people in the middle who are just unsure, who are a bit nervous about the situation, are just waiting, to see whether there are any better options come along from their perspective. So that inevitably can create some level of tension within a workplace when you've got all those different opinions on issues like this. Do you think that represents a reasonable justification for instruction? One of our participants has asked that, to try and provide that clarity from an employment perspective.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, for both of you.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the time frames involved. So I think the particular question I saw was in relation to Novavax. And I have heard that in a couple of occasions, that employees saying, I'm not anti-vax, I'm pro-Novavax, and they're waiting for Novavax. But I'm just not sure what the timeframes are. And there may be, therefore, a capacity to allow them to access accrued annual leave, long service leave, or leave without pay for a period of time pending that process, if that's going to be reasonable from that perspective.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the addition onto that one is that, it's our role to create the space for stories like that to emerge, where it can become a pretty unsafe environment for people because if we start to use vaccination as a badge of honour and people become proud, and you have these people who are in the middle, unsure, uncertain, perhaps with a private medical condition that's causing, more concerns, that's where we need to meet the topic with a sense of sensitivity, with discussion without judgment, and that judgment becomes more prominent when we see a larger group of vaccinated people coming together, that can really start to ostracize people who are in that space. And you kind of, particularly in the younger demographics, there's some research that was shared by Facebook where they've had to put tags on 180 million pieces of information in Facebook, remove 80 million pieces of data that's blatantly incorrect about vaccinations. And that's where some research into young females, they didn't specify the age, but I'm assuming in that sort of 15 to 23 year mark, that there's that sense of 93% of them, being scared of the actual accuracy of information that they're receiving. 85% believing that they're actually receiving incorrect information, so that, and to the degree that some people feel just scared that they were going to die by getting the vaccination. And so if we can't create the space for people to bring this up, talk about it, and access information that's going to help them, that's what we need to be able to move towards.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because those of us who have been vaccinated, we need to understand those like we said, you will get those people who you're never going to convince, etc. But there's definitely a group of people within workplaces and within the community who are concerned, who are relying on social media, and we need to work with them, definitely. Okay, Alex, one for you. Someone has actually said a question for Alex. Regarding this issue of compensation, if an employee contracts COVID in the workplace, this person has asked, does this still hold if the employee was not vaccinated?
I'm assuming if someone gets COVID in the workplace, the issue around workers' compensation, I would say that there's no outcome on that yet, but I would expect that would be the case. I would expect that unless there was a requirement for mandatory vaccination and that requirement had not been met, that workers' comp will still accept it. I mean, I just can't see the regulatory authority not accepting it in that situation.
Yeah.
But it's unknown at this stage.
Yeah, that's a really challenging one. And another question, in Queensland, without a public health order mandate, if an employer implements a policy for mandatory vaccinations, if end of employment is not reasonable, how long would the temporary options likely be required, e.g. working from home, redeployment, special leave, etc.?
It really can't give a general answer. We'll have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. It might be that you put in place a trial of work from home for a period of time to be reviewed at the end, and if it's not working, then you move to termination. It might be you say, okay, we'll put in leave without pay or leave for a period of 3 months, and we review it at that time. I think the key is that if you are going to some alternative arrangement, that it have a life and a sunset and a review process built into it, and it's not just allowed to meander on, because this could go on for 12 months, 18 months. Who knows? Nobody really knows at the moment. So while organisations are treading carefully in relation to not necessarily jumping straight to termination, I think we have to be careful that we're not creating a bigger problem for ourselves in 3, 6 months, 9 months' time.
Yeah, okay. We're coming up to the last 5 minutes of the webinar, so please send through any questions. And like we said, if we can't answer them now, we will answer them later. But one of the other questions I wanted to ask, if workers' compensation will apply in relation to COVID-19, does this not establish a significant precedent for any number of other conditions, such as the flu?
Yeah, I mean, some of those early cases that I referred to were specifically in relation to flu vaccination. So, yes, there is potential for that, but I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been described as a once-in-a-lifetime event. So I'm not expecting that we will see this used as a precedent for similar kind of rollouts of other things down the track.
Okay. And then, what about those issues around if a company doesn't have mandatory vaccination in the workplace, has made a decision not to have a policy around that area, but some of their employees are refusing to work with people who haven't been vaccinated. So people themselves have been vaccinated, but they won't and are refusing to work with people who haven't been vaccinated. What do you think about that issue?
Again, these are the complications, that there's the very passionate supporters on both sides of the vaccination debate. And in that circumstance, I guess you have to look at the practicalities of how can it operate. So if they're saying, I'm refusing to work with them, does that mean you can relocate them? Does that mean you can change hours? Does that mean you can break your workplace into zones? Does that mean you can require certain people to wear, full PPE? So, medical gown, surgical mask, and, plastic visor. Will that give people enough comfort to work beside that individual? Do you have social distancing? So there's no right or wrong answer. It's really about playing it out and seeing what is the most appropriate in any particular workplace at any particular time.
Yeah. It's very specific again to the workplace and the actual issues at hand. So another question, given the nature of the COVID situation, where vaccinated and unvaccinated employees are still both able to catch COVID, How would the Commission view the argument that both vaccinated and unvaccinated employees are equally exposed to catching and transmitting the virus in the workplace, yet the unvaccinated employee was stood down or terminated?
I think that the difference is that the unvaccinated employee, the consequences of that individual getting COVID is much greater than the vaccinated. So the OH&S obligations placed on the employer for that individual can only be met, arguably, if they are vaccinated. So the risk is much greater. And while the risk of acquiring it, and I'm not 100% sure if that's right, but let's just assume it is, the risk of acquiring it is the same, but the consequences of the risk is completely different.
Yeah. Okay, we have hit the magic hour, and we still have a lot of questions that are being sent through. So what we will do is Alex Blake and myself will go through those questions and try to get back to all of you with an answer. The other thing we want to emphasise is that, you know, you can contact the three of us, Alex and Blake in our Brisbane office, myself in our Perth office, or any of our consultants if you do have some specific questions around these areas. As I think we've managed to emphasise today, there's no right or wrong, black or white in this particular area. It's very specific to the workplace. It's very specific to the individual employee's circumstances. So really emphasise to all of you that you need to look at your own specific circumstances within your organisation. This isn't an off-the-shelf type scenario where you can just pick something off the shelf and work with that. So I think we will leave it there because we've hit our hour. Thank you all for participating. We will come back to all of you, and we look forward to speaking to all of you again soon. Thanks.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.